It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But if I'm being honest, the distance started long before the betrayal. It started in the quiet. In the dinners where we stared at our phones instead of each other. In the half-hearted kisses, the forgotten anniversaries, and the way he said love you like a routine, not a feeling. Daniel and I got married when I was 25. Back then, I believed in fairy tales. I believed in building something together, in sacrifice, in loyalty. I supported his business dreams, gave up my own job opportunities, moved for him, molded myself to fit the life he envisioned. And for a while, that was enough. But over time, it started to feel like I was the only one trying. He used to ask me how my day was. He used to touch my back when I walked by, used to look at me like he couldn't believe I was his. Now, his eyes barely linger. If I ask for time, he tells me he's swamped. If I dress up, he tells me he's tired. If I cry, he doesn't notice. I wasn't asking for magic, I just wanted to matter. To feel like I still existed in the world we once promised each other. I remember one night specifically. I spent hours getting ready. Hair, makeup, the red dress he once said made his jaw drop. We had a reservation, a plan. He came home an hour late, took one look at me, and said he forgot. Said a client call ran over. He kissed my cheek, said next time, and went straight to his laptop. I sat there in silence, mascara stinging my eyes. I didn't say anything. What was the point? That's what it became. Me, swallowing disappointment like vitamins. Trying not to seem too sensitive. Pretending it was fine. That he was just busy. That this was what real relationships looked like. But deep down, I was starving. Not for sex. For affection. For being noticed. For being asked how I was, and actually meaning it. And then I met Miles. He wasn't remarkable, not at first. Just a guy at the cafe near my gym. Barista, maybe. All I remember is that he handed me my chai latte with a smile and said, "Ava, right." I blinked. No one remembers my name. Not even Daniel half the time. Miles did. It threw me off. The next time I came in, he asked how my weekend was. I almost didn't know what to say. My weekends were just laundry, silence, and scrolling on my phone next to a man who barely looked up. But Miles leaned in slightly, like he actually cared about the answer. I told him it was okay. He said, "You deserve better than okay." I laughed. I told myself he was just being friendly. It didn't mean anything, but I walked away smiling. That's how it started. A few words, a few smiles. Nothing dangerous, not yet. Just lightness. It made me feel warm inside in a way I hadn't in years. I'd spend the rest of the day thinking about that interaction, replaying it in my head. Not because I wanted him, but because for once, someone saw me. Daniel didn't notice anything. Why would he? He was always busy. Always stressed. Always talking about the next deal, the next client. I could have dyed my hair blue and he probably wouldn't have looked up. I stopped trying. I stopped talking at all during dinner. We'd sit in silence, both of us scrolling through separate lives, and then, one afternoon, I saw Miles again. I was in a rush, hair messy, face bare, not trying to impress anyone. He still smiled. Still remembered my name. Said, "You look real today." And something about that sentence stuck. Real. Not perfect. Not made up. Just real. I went home that night and cried in the shower. Not because of him, but because I felt more seen by a man who knew me for 5 minutes than by the man who promised to love me forever. Still, I hadn't done anything. Not yet. I hadn't touched anyone. I hadn't crossed a line. But I could see it now, where the line was. And I could feel how close I was getting to it. The guilt started to flicker, but the ache was louder. And in the silence of my marriage, that ache was the only thing I could hear. I didn't plan it. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray my marriage. It happened in the tiny cracks, the ones that widened every time I felt alone in a room we both occupied. After that night in the shower, I started going to the cafe more often. Sometimes twice a day. I told myself I liked the coffee. But it wasn't the drink. It was the way Miles looked at me like I wasn't invisible. He didn't flirt, not really. He listened. He remembered things. Asked questions about books I mentioned, laughed at my bad jokes, complimented my thoughts, not my body. He never made a move, but something in his attention wrapped around me like safety. The more he spoke, the more I remembered who I used to be. Before the silence. Before I shrank myself to be convenient for someone else's schedule. One evening, Daniel and I had a fight. A small one, like always. I asked if we could talk. He said, "Now? I've got numbers to run." I told him I missed him. He said, "We live together, how could you miss me?" That line hit like a slap. I left without a word, keys in hand, no destination. Somehow, I ended up outside that cafe. It was closed, but Miles was inside, wiping down counters. He saw me, opened the door, and asked if I was okay. I said yes. Then no. Then I broke down and cried in the middle of the empty shop. He handed me a napkin and didn't say anything for a while. Just stood there, quietly present. When I finally spoke, I told him more in 20 minutes than Daniel had heard in a year. I told him I felt like I was disappearing. Like I could vanish from my own life and no one would notice. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. After that, things shifted. It was like something invisible had been exchanged. I started thinking about him when I woke up. Smiling at texts that weren't romantic but felt more intimate than anything I had with my husband. Miles never crossed the line. I did. I made the choice to keep returning. To keep opening doors I should have left shut. The night it happened, I was the one who leaned in. I was the one who kissed him. There was no hesitation, no pulling back. It was soft, tentative, but I knew what I was doing. I wanted to feel something, anything, that reminded me I was still here. That I wasn't just a role, wife, supporter, background noise. I wanted to feel like a woman again. It wasn't lust. It wasn't passion. It was hunger. Emotional, desperate hunger. The kind that comes after years of emotional neglect, of trying to keep something alive when only one person's watering it. With Miles, I felt warmth. A flicker of something I hadn't tasted in so long I almost forgot it existed. Afterward, I waited for the guilt to crash in. But it didn't. Not right away. What I felt was relief. Not because I wanted to hurt Daniel, but because for a moment, I remembered what it felt like to be held. To be chosen. To be seen without asking for it. Of course, the guilt came later. When I looked at my phone and saw a message from Daniel asking if I needed anything from the store. Normal, routine, domestic. He had no idea I had just betrayed him. That I had just let someone else touch the parts of me he stopped reaching for, but even in guilt, I didn't stop. We saw each other again. It wasn't frequent. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even about sex. It was about safety. Connection. I lied. I made excuses. I created gaps in my day and filled them with a secret that gave me more comfort than the cold bed I shared every night. Daniel didn't change. He never noticed. Not when I came home late, not when I smiled more, not even when I wore perfume again. He had his routines, his spreadsheets, his meetings. I became just another item in the background, something stable and always there. I started wondering if he even loved me anymore, or if he just loved the idea of someone being there, silent and supportive. What I did wasn't right. But it didn't come from cruelty. It came from erosion. From slowly falling apart and realizing no one was going to catch me. I didn't cheat because I was selfish. I cheated because I was starving. I cheated because I begged in silence for years and got used to the echo. It wasn't just my body I gave to someone else. It was my grief. My resentment. My craving to be noticed. I wanted to forget who I had become. Just for a little while. And in his arms, I did. I felt human again. And that terrified me more than anything else. He found out 3 weeks later. Not because I confessed, but because I got careless. A text I forgot to delete. One line. Nothing explicit, just enough to raise questions. I came home to silence that wasn't normal, not the kind we'd been living in. It was heavy, still, expectant. He handed me my phone and said, "Who's Miles?" I didn't lie. There was no point. I stared at the floor and said, "Someone who made me feel like I existed." The words came out before I could think. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just looked at me like I was someone he didn't know anymore. And maybe I wasn't. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. It was sad. He asked me when it started. I told him after the night he forgot our anniversary, again. He asked why I didn't say anything. I said I did. In every way I knew how. In notes left on the fridge. In the silence after you cancelled plans. In the questions you stopped asking. I wasn't quiet because I didn't care. I was quiet because talking to you felt like speaking into a void. He said he'd been stressed, that work had consumed him. He didn't know I was feeling this way. That hurt the most. The not knowing. The complete absence of awareness. I had been unraveling in front of him for months, maybe years, and he hadn't seen a thing. Not because he was cruel, but because he had stopped looking. Stopped listening. We both had. We tried therapy. One session. He sat stiff, arms crossed, like it was a punishment. I answered every question. I cried. He stayed silent. When we got back home, he said, "I can't do this." I nodded. I didn't fight it. I was too tired to pretend we still had something to save. He moved out a week later. Took his things in quiet, deliberate trips. I watched from the kitchen, unsure if I was grieving or relieved. Maybe both. The house felt empty without him, but it had felt hollow for a long time. At least now the silence had honesty in it. I didn't see Miles again after that. I didn't go back to the cafe. I deleted his number. Not because I blamed him, but because I needed to face myself. I had used him as a bandage for wounds I never acknowledged. What I felt wasn't love. It was validation. The kind that fades fast when you're finally alone with your choices. The hardest part wasn't the guilt. It was the shame. Shame for becoming someone I swore I'd never be. For betraying a man I once loved. For letting loneliness turn me into a stranger. People think cheating is all lust and secrets, but sometimes it's quiet desperation. It's needing to feel alive when you're emotionally dead. I spent weeks trying to justify it to myself. He neglected me. He stopped trying. He made me feel invisible. All of that was true. But none of it erased the fact that I broke something I can't rebuild. And when the dust settled, I had to sit with that. No excuses. No distractions. Just me and the wreckage. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist on my own. Not to fix my marriage, it was already gone, but to understand why I had abandoned myself so completely. I had lost more than my husband. I had lost my voice, my confidence, my sense of worth. I'd given so much of myself away, there was barely anything left. I don't hate Daniel. I never did. He wasn't cruel. He was distant, consumed, emotionally unavailable, but not malicious. And maybe that's what makes it harder to explain. You don't have to be abused to be unhappy. Sometimes, it's just the slow erosion of connection. The way two people can live together and drift so far apart they forget how to reach each other. There are no villains in this story. Just two people who stopped seeing each other. One who withdrew, and one who went looking. And both of us lost something that day, not just each other, but the version of ourselves we thought we'd always be. Now I'm trying to rebuild, not a marriage, but myself. Trying to forgive what I did, without pretending it didn't happen. Trying to understand that loneliness doesn't excuse betrayal, but it can explain the path you take when you're too broken to ask for help. I still believe in love. I still believe in connection. But now, I know it can't survive in silence. That love isn't just presence, it's effort. It's listening. It's choosing someone, over and over, even when it's inconvenient. I wasn't chosen. And eventually, I stopped choosing too. I gave my body to someone else. But more than that, I gave away pieces of myself I didn't know I still had. And now, I'm picking them up one by one. Slowly. Carefully. Alone, people always ask, would you do it again if you knew how it would end? And I don't know how to answer that without sounding heartless or broken. The truth is, I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm also not the same woman who stayed silent in her marriage for 3 years hoping someone would notice she was fading. I've stopped looking at it as a single act of betrayal. It was a symptom. A result of neglect. A warning ignored for far too long. In the aftermath, everything felt like a slow-motion collapse. Friends took sides. Some blamed him, others blamed me. I stopped trying to explain. No one sees the full picture. They see either the ring or the ashes. Never the slow decay in between. I lost people. People I thought would understand. But what hurt more was the isolation. The assumption that because I made the mistake, I deserved to carry all of the weight. Daniel and I finalized the divorce quickly. No drawn-out battle, no messy custody fights. We didn't have kids, which was both a curse and a blessing. We signed papers in silence, hands barely shaking. At the last minute, he asked if I had loved him at the end. I wanted to say yes, to give him something. But I couldn't lie again. I said, I loved who we used to be. I don't know who we became. He nodded. That was the last time we saw each other. I moved out 2 months later. New apartment, smaller, quieter. No framed wedding photos. No reminders. Just white walls and a mattress on the floor at first. I started from zero. Not just with furniture, but with myself. I had spent so many years shaping myself around someone else's priorities that I didn't even know what I liked anymore. What music? What food? What kind of woman I even wanted to be. For the first time in years, I had space to breathe. Space to feel without being judged. Without being ignored. I cried for things that had nothing to do with the affair. I cried because I missed the idea of safety. Because I hated being the villain. Because I was ashamed of needing someone so badly I gave away parts of myself to feel seen. Healing didn't come in waves. It came in pieces. Small ones. Waking up and not checking my phone for his messages. Eating dinner alone and not feeling like it meant I was unwanted. Looking in the mirror and seeing a whole person, not just a wife or a cheater. Miles never reached out. I'm glad he didn't. What we shared wasn't built to last, it was built to fill a void. And once that need was exposed, it couldn't hold the weight of reality. I don't blame him. He gave me attention when I was drowning. But what I needed wasn't attention. It was a voice. A spine. A sense of self I hadn't developed because I had poured all my identity into someone else's comfort point. One night, I sat on my new couch and realized I hadn't thought about either of them for a full day. Not Miles. Not Daniel. Just me. That moment felt bigger than the betrayal, bigger than the fallout. It felt like a return. Like I was finally stepping into my own life, not as someone's partner, not as someone's regret, but as a woman who made mistakes and is still allowed to move forward. People say infidelity is unforgivable. Maybe they're right. Maybe what I did is something Daniel will never be able to understand or release. But forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to keep from drowning in your own remorse. I'm learning to forgive myself. Slowly. Carefully. Honestly, I've made peace with the fact that I will always be someone who once cheated. That truth lives in my story now. But it doesn't define me. What defines me is what I choose to do with that truth. How I let it shape me, not shrink me. I'm not the same woman who sat waiting for a man to notice her pain. I'm not the same woman who thought validation from someone else could fix what was broken inside. I own what I did. I carry it, but I also move forward with it. It doesn't paralyze me anymore. It reminds me. That silence can be louder than screaming. That neglect is not always violent, but it is dangerous. That choosing yourself isn't selfish when you've been disappearing for years. If I could go back, I'd change the way I handled everything. I would speak louder. I would leave sooner. I would demand better, not from someone else, but from myself. But the past can't be rewritten. It can only be understood. And I understand now that love without presence is not love. That marriage without connection is just a contract. And that no amount of outside affection can heal the wounds you keep hidden from yourself. This isn't a redemption story. It's not a justification. It's just the truth. A hard, messy, human truth. I gave someone else my body. But I gave away pieces of myself long before that night. Now, I'm slowly putting them back together, not to be someone else's again, but to finally be mine.